The Institute of Internal Auditors presents All Things Internal Audit Tech. In this episode, Adam Ross is joined by Filipe Ribeiro and Julien Perreault to discuss how supply chain risk has evolved into an interconnected, enterprise-wide challenge. They discuss where organizations underestimate exposure and why internal audit is uniquely positioned to identify blind spots before disruptions escalate. The conversation spans real-world examples from agriculture and highly regulated businesses, third-party risk, continuous monitoring, and the growing impact of automation and AI on supply chains.
I'm joined by two leaders in the industry. One is an internal auditor and one specializes in supply chain risk management, working directly with management to help manage some of these supply chain risks and implement the risk management and control activities that we'll be talking about today. And with that, why don't we go ahead and dive right in? And Filipe and Julien, let's get started with something broad. And Filipe, I would love for you to chime in on this first. When we talk about supply chain risk today, it feels very different than it did even a few years ago. What do you think has changed the most? And why should internal audit be paying more attention now than previously?
That's a great place to start, actually, because I do believe that supply chain risks today is totally different from what it was even 5 or 6 years ago. I believe that back then was mainly seen as a logistic issue rather than something else. Nowadays, the reality has changed. The supply chains have become more deeply interconnected ecosystems. Risk doesn't sit only in trucks and ports anymore. It sits end-to-end with supplier selections, contract structures, data qualities, cyber exposure, and most of the cases, geopolitical dependencies. Those risks have moved from what I used to call before operational inconvenience to what we now call for more strategic business risks. That's where I think we internal auditors we play an important role nowadays. We are only one of the functions of the company that can see all of these risks interconnected and to proper assess how it can impact the operation. So our role is not longer just to review controls after something goes wrong, but it's to challenge assumptions before it happens.
I love your phrase that moving from an operational inconvenience to a more strategic risk. That certainly warrants a lot more attention than it has in the past. Julien, interested in your thoughts on what's changed over the last couple of years.
Yeah, agreed with Felipe 100%. I mean, it's definitely become a much more systemic part of supply chains, understanding whether there's a weather event, labor strikes, a supplier bankruptcy, were one of your key components. You really need to understand where those risks were treated as exceptions historically, are now being managed through contingency plans, right? You need to make sure that those aren't exceptions, but it's more the operating environment that you control today and making sure that you have strong escalation paths to really make sure you're making the right decisions moving forward.
Totally agree with that. Julien, as we build on that kind of the current state of supply chain risk, maybe you can talk a little bit about where organizations most commonly underestimate supply chain risk and where do things look good on paper when, someone says, don't worry, we got this, but then in actuality, really maybe not as good as we had all hoped it would be.
100%. I think the big issue is organizations get into this lull where they see that performance appears to be stable and well documented. So they're looking at their dashboards and the KPIs are all green. You have key contracts in place with not only just your key suppliers, but all of your suppliers. And the risk register shows moderate exposure. That usually organizations feel like it shows reliance, but many of these mechanisms are looking backwards, right? So what happens when that KPI goes from green to yellow or jumps from green to red? It's explaining what's already happened in the past, but not looking at about what is going to fail in the near future. I think there's a lot of issues within planning specifically, right? Forecasts are often treated as commitments. Capacity is assumed rather than stress tested, and inventory strategies are optimized for efficiency rather than variability, which is a big problem that we see today. These assumptions generally hold during stable periods, but unravel very quickly under stress. And how can that stress be mitigated by the organization moving forward?
Wow, you hit on three really articulate items there where it sounds like the underlying cause of potential issue is the assumption that things are going to happen as they historically have or you might expect them to be. But the reality is always, but more so in today's ever-evolving environment, that there is a level of volatility and unpredictability that organizations probably need to be a little bit better prepared for and frankly acknowledge and incorporate into their modeling.
Absolutely. And I think it's also another issue that organizations have is what's the behavior of your organization when a risk incident happens or an exposure happens, right? A lot of times people will find solutions to those problems locally to make sure that operations are moving. Planners will look at the forecast and override it. Logistics teams will expedite freight. Finance will tolerate an exception. Independently, these decisions are rational and make sense to keep the business moving. But collectively, if they are unmanaged, they create a massive enterprise risk. The organization absorbs risk informally without acknowledging it or governing it.
Filipe, coming back to you, and really wanted to lean into your industry experience in agricultural. You've had the opportunity to audit across the agricultural value chain. Can you maybe share an example where a risk early on, like farming, sourcing, or inputs, seemed pretty minor or insignificant, but quietly grew into a much bigger issue downstream?
Yes, for sure. And this actually happens more often than people realize, especially in agriculture. I like to say that I had the privilege to live in certain different countries and continents. And earlier in my career, when I was working a project in South America, at the beginning of the season, of the agricultural season, everything looked pretty much fine. The contracts were signed, the supplies were approved, pricing was locked in. Apparently, the supply was totally secured. But what was not fully visible for us, however, at that time is that several of these suppliers were just relying in one single source of inputs on the upstream part of the business. And, when certain geopolitical restrictions arose on the country at that time, impacting the logistics and create certain bottlenecks, the deliveries did not stop, but they were delayed. At the first moment, it didn't seem critical, but you know how agriculture is. It's extremely timely sensitive, and missing a treatment window by even a few weeks can deeply affect the yields. And that early delay quietly reduced the outputs, of course. Not enough on the beginning to trigger certain alarms, but enough to create a gap. The gap that months later appeared on the downstream part of the business, with lower volumes entering on the inventory, processing plants downtimes, higher logistic costs, inventory locations, and also, of course, customer commitments being renegotiated. And what has started as just a small upstream delay ultimately affected the yield, the production planning, the customer fulfillment, and also their margins. I believe this is a good example how the supply chain risk often doesn't explode immediately, but it accumulates silently over the time.
Was there any time when internal audit got involved or became aware of the issue? And if so, what role did internal audit play in helping management navigate the risk or do something post-mortem?
Actually, at that time, we used it to work as a continuous monitoring auditing department, and we started to notice this issue when the numbers across the value chain stopped telling the same story. Upstream, the procurement, and as Julien said, everything on the dashboards was showing green, the contracts fulfilled, the suppliers were marked as compliant. But downstream, the production forecasts were being adjusted frequently, the logistic costs were creeping up, the inventory plans were being adjusted more often than usual. Individually, none of these signs would seem be so alarming at the beginning. But when you start to overlay them, like the procurement timelines, the yield expectations, and even the planning assumptions, the logic just broke and we start to identify some patterns and red flags. The input had arrived on the paper, yet on the fields, it was telling a different story. That's when the internal audit realized that the issue wasn't a supplier failure or a control breakdown in isolation, but it was much more a timing risk hidden between functions, delays that were somehow operationally absorbed, but economically accumulating over time.
Julie, maybe you can talk a little bit about where some organizations commonly believe they have good visibility into their supply chain and the predicted performance, but then often don't. And what is some of the data points that might help improve that visibility to address the issue that Filipe just identified or another similar one?
I mean, I think organizations, once again, feel they get into that sense of complacency once they have strong visibility into, orders, inventory level, shipments, supplier performance, and metrics. But again, that's all historical looking data and information. And even with the rise of AI and analytics to estimate and game the system of where this could happen in the future, it's not all that great yet. And a lot of organizations just, like I said, rely heavily on that historical data. I think the real blind spot is the dependencies, the capacity, and time. Organizations often don't understand how dependent their products, their plants, and their regions are on the same inputs and infrastructures, right? So there's that concentration of supplier knowledge, resources that really they don't focus on or look at as heavily because, again, the visibility is there. They think they have the information available at their fingertips to look at when something poorly is going to happen, but you don't know what you don't know. And if that information isn't being fed into your organization one way or another, you're not going to know what that risk is really going to have on your organization.
So true. Filipe, going back to you, you talked about the internal audit function's continuous monitoring, which also helped to bring to light some of the struggles that were kind of evolving and expanding pretty quickly. Can you maybe talk just a little bit more about what continuous monitoring was being performed? Is it specific controls, or were you just monitoring kind of production performance and seeing the slippage in scheduling? Although everything was flashing green all the way upstream, when it actually came to manufacturing and fulfillment, things were starting to slip, it sounds like.
At that time, the corporate governance layers were pretty much structured with the three defense line models in place, and then we had some KPIs alongside all of the departments, and it was a business with the upstream and downstream part. It was really well integrated, so we had access to all of the KPIs, and certain of these KPIs were connected to certain triggers that would generate alerts for us in case of something went out of our thresholds. And it was pretty much interesting because it's exactly as I was saying. In one part of the business, you can see that everything was flagged perfectly, and on the other part, you could not see this reflex happening on the real operational reality. And most of the cases, as we know, when we work with continuous monitoring, it's still a challenge to eliminate certain false positives, and it still takes some time to clear all of the data. But the data will keep showing and showing and showing. You already had the indication that something had happened in the past. So for us, it was kind of easy to connect the root cause with what was being showing on the dashboards.
I appreciate that. And fortunately, that information was available, because it does seem like many organizations struggle with data quality. And, the fact that you had good data to start with, hopefully, even though it turned into a bigger issue, it could have been an even worse issue if the data wasn't there to help kind of navigate the challenge and course correct where appropriate. Filipe, also sticking with you, just wanted to talk a little bit about certain supply chain considerations. And I think this is applicable to many organizations, whether they manufacture a product or otherwise, but there's many industries and product categories that have supply chains that are either remote, extremely capital intensive, and or highly regulated. And maybe you can talk a little bit about risk in those environments that can be specifically challenging for internal audit. What makes them challenging, and how can internal audit best respond to some of those challenges?
I think in this type of organization, the biggest challenge that all of these risks happen on the same time, because our type of operations that are usually operating far away from cities, ports, and basically infrastructure. So when something goes wrong, there is usually no plan B, or when there is a plan B, it's hard to test under a pressure situation to proper assess if control will perform correctly or not. And when the production is at risk, the decisions change, right? The priority becomes keeping the planting running. That's when you start seeing the emergency procurement, manual workarounds, and also some cases where the controls are even bypassed. I like to say that in theory, the governance looks strong, but we know that urgency usually wins. And there is also a cultural layer that I would like to add here, is that specifically in these remote areas, these sites depend heavily on the local contractors and certain informal ways to keep the production moving. Operationally, it works, but they don't always fit nicely into governance frameworks. So that's why internal audit is the challenge usually isn't finding risks, but it's try to understand how the business actually behave when things go wrong, and how we can mitigate these risks in a way to not stop the business and to guarantee that we are proper fulfilling the governance frameworks.
Yeah, I've heard some stories, especially where there's source materials coming from remote locations. And I think many of us as internal auditors, sometimes we're a little more comfortable, or we expect a bit of a corporate feel for how work gets done. But when you're out in the field with a pick and you're mining something and you're working really long hours and days, and there's physical safety, people do certain things that maybe is a little bit different than what you might do if you're an accounts payable clerk sitting in a desk in a corporate location. And sometimes it's hard for us as internal auditors to just understand that certain procedures, certain behaviors, certain relationships need to evolve. They still could be reasonably controlled, but it just might not be the way we're most commonly used to seeing as internal auditors, where we're sitting in a comfortable office that's air conditioned and all those things. So I certainly appreciate that. One other topic I wanted to think about here briefly, and Julien, I'm going to throw you an audible here in just a moment. So I have a client that's in waste management, and one of their challenges is balancing their regulatory compliance requirement for the secure movement, disposal, permanent storage of these hazardous materials with the highest and best use of their network. They might have a facility in Nevada and they might be picking up hazardous product in Nevada, but that product isn't licensed to process or dispose of that hazardous product. And they have to move it to the location that is licensed, which could be Alabama. So how, as a supply chain risk specialist, do you balance regulatory compliance with operational efficiency, productivity, and profitability?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and something that we see a lot of organizations struggle with. Obviously you need to be following all of the regulatory requirements within your specific industry, but I think there's a lot of new software that's coming out that allows you to really optimize your supply chain and put in a lot of data, right? If it's a waste management company, they probably have a lot of information on where their clients sit, where that waste has been going historically, what sites can process that kind of waste, and put all that information into those systems to really help look and understand as what is going to be the lowest cost option to get that waste from point A to point B, where it's being processed. Are there any additional licenses that need to be considered if it's going across many state lines? Because obviously not all states are following. There's different rules and regulations in each for how to move those goods across those lines. So I really think that leveraging the technology that has been created the last 5 to 10 years to really optimize your supply chain network in that regard specifically has really helped a lot with the governance, because you can put all that information into the system and it optimizes it to the best of its ability. Now, obviously, with anything AI, it gets you to a certain point. There still needs to be that human in the loop to review everything and make sure that it's working correctly, and that there's no errors or assumptions that it made incorrectly. But yeah, I think that's a big push and a big change in a lot of network distributions that we've been seeing today.
So understanding where the materials historically have come from and best guess on where it might be coming from, the fleet that's available to transport it, the permissible routes to transport it, the facilities and their throughput processing capability when they're licensed to process it, and then making sure obviously you're complying with all the regulatory obligations, whether it be EPA or other departmental governmental filings, all the paperwork, and being able to support the activities while also really trying to maintain profitability of the business and keep every asset as productive as possible to really improve on that.
Absolutely. And I think what you can kind of find is maybe you have a overperforming site somewhere and an underperforming site elsewhere, and you can reroute potentially some of the work to those other sites to make sure, to your point, that your assets are being used to the most of their to the best of their capacity and increasing profitability in that regard.
So real-time rerouting, which sounds like an awfully cool internal audit to perform if I'm putting my internal audit hat on there. So very, very neat, very informative. Thank you. Julien, sticking with you, want to shift kind of the perspective on supply chain risk, focusing more on kind of the procure-to-pay side of it. So the ordering and the invoicing and the receipt and obviously the remittance. Where do you see most often supply chain risk showing up in day-to-day operations related to procure-to-pay activities, not just during a crisis?
Yeah. And as Felipe mentioned, it usually isn't just this massive blown crisis. Obviously, there are fire drills that happen and all hands on deck to resolve those issues. I mean, we'd love to say that there was never those types of issues in our day-to-day activities, but it always is. But I think more frequently it shows up as kind of that operational noise, right? So there's rush orders, after the fact PO approvals, invoices that are sent the day they're due instead of to the AP inbox where like they're supposed to be followed. and then also rush approval and receipt processes to make sure that everything in the system is approved in order to release release that payment to the supplier. I think when you step back, these kind of day-to-day operational noises reflect a much deeper issue, and that it's the supply chain and the process is really compensating for broken assumptions rather than correcting them. Right? Supply chains are somewhat flexible, and if with them being flexible, they're able to kind of bend when needed. But really, if you don't correct the root cause, you're not really going to solve that problem long term. I think for internal audit specifically, the opportunity is really to take a step back and look horizontally across all the functions instead of vertically within them, which happens more frequently, and asking whether the transactions follow the policy, but really ask why the organization required so many exceptions to operate on a day-to-day basis.
The increase in exceptions is usually a pretty good indicator. When I put my old control tester hat on, I go back to the days where individuals would have, the test of 25, and there would be 15 different tick marks to explain why none of the items were an exception, but no two followed the same exact predictable path. And I finally came up with this: if you need more than 2 or 3 tick marks, then it's not a common process. I'm making a very broad claim here, but more likely than not, the more tick marks is, the more different ways transactions are processed, and the higher risk of potential failure and just insufficient oversight, because you're constantly dealing with the exception and not the normal predictable process. Filipe, I'd like to come back to you here. And are you aware of a situation where a supply chain disruption revealed a broader governance operating model or broader control weakness that was not previously identified?
Yes, I have one example that I've seen, that it's when the supply chain planning and the procurement start drifting out of sync. The planning process, most of the cases look pretty much solid. The forecasts are approved, the volumes are aligned, and most of the time the capacity assumptions make sense. But in practice, as we all know, the demand changes more frequently than the planning cycle can absorb. The procurement teams then have to shift from a planned sourcing to a reactive buying. And this translates much more into spot purchases, short contracts. At the first moment, I believe the leadership doesn't see this as a risk at all, because the availability is still maintained, the production continues, and the customers are still being served. But the things happen behind the scenes when the governance starts to weaken. The controls that were previously designed for a planned procurement no longer fit to emergency decisions. And then that's where the exceptions become the routine. And if a disruption eventually hits, and whether it's a logistics or geopolitical or even a supplier failure, the issue starts to become like the issues that the operational model had already shifted from a structured planning to a continuous firefighting. And that's when usually the leadership sees that the resilience, it's not only about having backup suppliers, but it's about the alignment between planning, procurement, data, decision rights, and whether the operating model still works when the conditions are no longer stable.
Julien, curious if you have any other thoughts or perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think another big thing, and Filipe, I agree 100% with everything you mentioned, and it's really back to that decision making, right? I feel like within governance models, there's usually clear escalation paths that should be followed. When A, B, C happens, what you need to do. But when there's an event, right, the paths are no longer as clear. And as I previously mentioned, people start making decisions in little silos to make sure that their operations are running smoothly at that local plant site or for that office. I think it's important that, you surface those one-off approvals, where decisions are being made, and really understand what is the root cause of why they were making those decisions, who should be responsible for making those decisions. So moving forward, you have your traditional path of escalation, but if there's these exceptions, who needs to actually be involved in the approval process, not making it too cumbersome or too slow, because then you're already delayed and behind and you can't actually get the approval up front, and you just have to make the decision yourself to keep the operations up and running.
So it sounds like delegation of authority is certainly a key item to make sure you have your arms around, and there's clarity around escalation, especially when something is becoming a challenge or individuals are not available to work a given potential issue.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right, so Filipe, you and I are going to have a brief conversation, internal auditor to internal auditor here. We're going to give Julien a little bit of a break unless he'd like to chime in. As we've talked about here, a lot of supply chain risk resides outside of an organization, outside of the proverbial four walls within the direct sphere of control. And one of the resources available to us as internal auditors is the new third-party risk topical requirement. And I'm curious from your thoughts with those new requirements available, do you see expectations changing for internal audit when it comes to supply chain risk and thinking about risk associated with suppliers and business partners? And if so, in what capacity?
Yes, definitely, definitely. And 'cause I believe that the third-party risk is no longer about managing vendors. It's about understanding vulnerability across the value chain. Before, we used it to review suppliers that say one by one. Did we do due diligence? Is the contract signed? Is the compliance checked? If the answer was yes, the supplier was, let's say, considered fine. This approach is no longer enough. I believe that today, a large part of the supply chain risk sits outside of the organization, as you mentioned clearly well on the question, and the expectations for the internal auditors are changing as well. It's no longer about checking individual vendors, but it's about understanding how dependent the business is on its external ecosystem. The third part, life cycle still matters, the selection, the contracting, the onboarding, monitoring, and the exit. But audit now needs to look at how all of these steps are connected and they can work together. It's now, for me, much more about a business resilience issue. And the internal audit is expected, I believe, to assess not only whether the control exists, but whether the operating model can withstand with the disruptions that definitely will happen. I like to say that before we had low likelihood events with high impact, and now we are going to have a lot of small events happening on the same time. And with not a big risk, but that are stressing too much the value chain, and we must be ready for this type of disruptions or interference.
That's great insights. And you hit on something that I believe is really, I'll say, in vogue right now is this whole concept of enterprise business resiliency, of which supply chain risk management and third-party risk management for all organizations, whether they have a tangible supply chain of direct materials for manufacturing or otherwise, is absolutely critical. And it's always this balance of making sure you're assessing risk and measuring performance and measuring risk on an ongoing basis quickly and effectively while not slowing down the speed of business. Because there's so many different risk domains. You talk about geopolitical, we talk about cyber, we talk about fourth party risk, the financial viability of those business partners. And most organizations have experts in those different risk areas. Each one of them or groups want to have a seat at the table to be able to evaluate. And I don't think anyone's trying to keep people out of the conversation, but at the same time, we can't wait 6 months to make a decision to engage a business partner when we got to get product to market. That continues to me seems to be a struggle for all organizations, even those that are regulatorily required to have formal third-party risk management guidelines. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts, or Julia, maybe you have a thought as well. Just how can internal audit help assess the effectiveness of third-party risk governance while also acknowledging that the pace and the speed with which business needs to be performed can continue for the business to deliver on its commitments?
I think it's a great question. I think the example there, the picture that came to mind with a lot of organizations that have TPRM is like the long Game of Thrones table, and each department is sitting at like kind of each corner of the table, close enough where you can hear each other, but like you have to definitely scream to be able to have a conversation across the table. And I think that's how a lot of organizations handle TPRM today is, each group is siloed and has the things that they need to do, check the boxes, make sure they have the information. But biggest problem is that information generally is not centrally stored. So if you have a financial issue, you need to go reach out to that person specifically who managed the assessment of the financial viability of that supplier, or cyber, someone who sits within IT. Really bringing those groups together and making sure that you have kind of like a risk classification for the type of suppliers that you're onboarding, and having a strong understanding of when an assessment should be completed, what is the frequency, who needs to really be involved, depending again on that type of supplier. Are they touching systems, or are they just a raw material supplier, for example? So I think it's to make sure that the day-to-day operations aren't delayed, having those classifications is really critical so that the right people are having the conversation for each supplier that's being onboarded.
So having that governance framework handy to allow call it the lead person working on this supplier relationship, understands the expectations of the different risk owners that might not require them to have to pull in those risk owners per se if the supplier is meeting the criteria that's been established by the organization. So the governance that Filipe talked about earlier is really what's critical in terms of and maintaining that as well, right? Your expectations on fourth party risk might change pretty dramatically. Or, in the US here, let's just say it's been an emotional roller coaster with tariffs and sanctions and types of things where organizations, one day it might be completely fine to source materials from country X, but then the next day sourcing materials from company X might go up by 25% or might not even be permitted anymore. And how do we react to that? So acknowledging that you have those guidelines and that governance oversight, but that it needs to be flexible to react to real-time actions that are occurring in the world. Well, as you can tell, I'm kind of geeking out about this stuff a little bit with you guys here. So thank you for indulging me. Filipe, starting with you, wanted to go back to kind of our procure-to-pay conversation here and a little less about financial risk and more operational risk. And I didn't know if you had a point of view on how organizations should think about concentration risk when there's limited suppliers for a given source of materials or just who competes in that space, but they're so critical to business operations. How should organizations think about that? How can they best manage some of that concentration risk?
Well, I would say that concentration becomes risky when the business loses its ability to react. Limited suppliers are often unavoidable. You can't simply diversify overnight when you have quality specifications, certifications, geography, and most of the cases, certain seasonalities that restrict the market. So the real question that I believe that organizations should be asking isn't, do we have multiple suppliers? But it's much more, how exposed are we if one of these suppliers fail? And that's why concentration risk needs to be assessed end to end, from the orange to the delivery, not just in a contractual level. From an operational perspective, I believe that the organizations should treat these critical suppliers almost like part of the infrastructure. If they go down, the production will stop. That means that concentration should be actively discussed, not only seated on the procurement, but also be involved with the planning and other departments with the company.
So at a minimum awareness of where your concentration risk resides and talking about it to understand if there are alternatives, but recognizing that it's quite possible that there is only one organization or a very limited number of organizations that can supply the product or the materials that are critical. And there might just need to be a level of risk that you just need to be comfortable with if you can't react to that concentration risk, if what I'm hearing correctly.
Exactly. And just adding one more layer to this discussion, for example, when you operate in continents such as Africa, it's not easy to reach the final supplier. You need to pass by many intermediates, traders, distributors, and most of them are just connected to the same big supplier. And you need to be aware that certain disruptions can happen, and you need to know when and how you are exposed to that. And I believe that's the biggest point that we need to be aware when we think about this type of concentration risks.
Julien, any other thoughts on supplier concentration risk?
Yeah, I think the key thing is, right, as Filipe mentioned, you get those efficiency gains of usually better pricing, better payment terms, shorter lead times, or some other just-in-time inventory system that you might be able to agree with within the contract. But I think the real issue with concentration is when that efficiency gain turns into fragility for your supply chain. And if you're able to plan ahead, and really one big thing that we've talked with a lot of our clients about is strategic partnerships with those strategic suppliers. Oftentimes it's at a transactional level. I need X amount of goods on this date, and here's the PO. Send it to me when I need it by. But really, especially in those highly regulated areas, becoming a strategic partner with your suppliers and understanding and getting thought leadership from them as well. They are the ones producing the goods that you need. What are their thoughts and what are their opinions on how the two organizations can collaborate to make sure that you're not just a transactional customer to them, you are now a partner, and both organizations can have efficiency gains as well. So, At the end of the day, when there is an issue or a catastrophic failure for them as a supplier, you might come to a priority list of still getting products and services where others who are just transactional probably won't.
Wow, that's great insights. We're just kind of shifting how you approach the relationship from transactional to strategic, and quote, or proverbially putting your arms around them to making sure that they are equally invested, and you're allocating the time and investments necessary and acknowledging the importance of this business relationship yourself. Very informative. Filipe, coming back to you, because you've had the opportunity to work across the world, Latin America, EMEA, Middle East. And you talked a little bit about this when we kind of started our conversation a little bit. How does geographic and cultural complexity amplify supply chain risk? And are there any areas where internal audit can help, address potential situations where that risk might be underestimated?
I do believe that the geographic and the cultural complex is one of the most underestimated supply chain risks I've ever seen. On paper, global supply chains look standardized. We use the same ERPs, the same policy, the same approval workflows. So there is often an assumption that the risk is consistent everywhere, but geography and culture fundamentally change how this process operates. Each region brings its own regulatory environment and even its own risk tolerance. So what works smoothly in Europe may operate very differently in parts of Latin America and Middle East, even if the process map looks like the same on the paper. And if where the internal auditors most often underestimate is the impact of what I call informal workarounds. As we mentioned before, the local teams, they often create some manual steps to keep the operation running, alternative suppliers, verbal agreements, emergency logistic routes, especially in high volatile regions. And these workarounds reduce the operational disruption, but on the other side, increase governance and data risk. And I believe that we need to understand how this supply chain actually functions on the ground, how the goods move from one side to another, how the decisions are made under pressure, and how the local realities interact with the global governance that the company is expecting. In the global supply chain, I believe the risk rarely fails in the design, but it fails much more into the translation from the policy to the practice, from the headquarters to the field. And that's exactly what I believe that we as internal auditors, we can add the most value.
So interesting. I know for sure, not so much related to direct materials, but we talk a lot in professional services just around the cultural differences associated with communications and decision making. In the United States, it's a very direct culture. We say yes and no pretty freely and directly, where other cultures might say yes, but. And that yes, but is a hard no. But if you don't know that yes, but means hard no, you get off the phone thinking, oh, we're good, but we might be delayed a little bit. Or it's a very hierarchical culture where individuals are deferential to their supervisors or make decisions more in a community. And it's super important to just understand how those decisions get made and what's actually being said with the words that people are using. And that doesn't even talk to some of those regulatory items or just how business gets done in a given geography. So really, really, really insightful thoughts there from someone that's done work across the world. Really interesting. Julien, coming back to you, someone that works with management all the time to help reduce supply chain risk and improve performance. Where are your thoughts on where internal audit can get more involved without compromising their independence?
Absolutely. And it's a tricky situation. I think historically internal audit has this misconception of the gotcha mentality, right? Like, oh, we're going to come in, ask a couple questions. You're usually trained to just answer the question that internal audit asks and don't expand past that. Now, if you expand and you accidentally say something that's out of line, immediately a finding. And now that kind of has closed the door between those stakeholders and internal audit forever, right? And I think moving forward, what I've seen a lot of internal audit organizations is, having more of the conversation, again, not looking reactive and saying, we got you, you did something wrong, you're going to get a slap on the wrist now. It's more about understanding how and why those decisions were actually made to be able to help those organizations and those departments make the right decision moving forward and give kind of recommendations. Again, it's not about owning the decision of what is right or wrong. It's more about giving your recommendations and saying, this is where we think you can improve to actually make your organization and your department better. Again, it's also across the organization because I think a lot of times, internal audit historically was looking vertically within each department. Now it's much more of a horizontal. How are all of these departments connected? Supply chain risks really rarely show up in just one place. They come across, from planning volatility, operational constraints, finance overruns, and compliance exposures that were not initially expected. So by connecting all the dots, they're able to give a better recommendation overall.
Okay. So I heard a few things that I think are worth repeating. One is, if you're not aware, as internal auditors, individuals that are going to be undergoing an internal audit often prep and possibly are even giving coaching. If you're not aware, that's quite common. And I just want to say thank you, Julien, for recognizing what we as internal auditors continually try to do individually and as a profession is our job is not to come and get people in trouble. Our job is to help come understand where the challenges are and help come up with pragmatic solutions to better manage risk and improve control and improve business performance. And that obviously it takes two to tango, right? To invite internal audit in to help before something has gone wrong. But it's also incumbent upon us as internal auditors to have that consultative mindset and not be just looking for a smoking gun. So thank you for that. Perspectives from a non-internal auditor, everyone. So thank you. Thank you.
No, and I think it's been a big shift already that I've seen within a lot of the clients that we serve. We generally partner a lot with their internal auditors. It's a big change, and I think it's a good thing for the practice and the the department within that organization. You're getting more insights, and the more insights you can get from your stakeholders, the better internal audit's going to be able to help you.
Awesome. Love it. Julien, would like to stick with you since we're kind of talking about working with management to reduce supply chain risks. Filipe, also interested in your thoughts on this as well. When we think about the horizon, the next 3 to 5 years, what are certain supply chain risks that we think are going to continue to emerge or evolve? And where should internal audit start preparing to think about and react to those risks, even if leadership is not have those fully contemplated and baked on their radars?
I think this comes as no surprise. I think supply chains are going to become more and more digital, right? I'm pretty proud of us. We haven't said AI more than a handful of times on this podcast. Typically, you hear AI talked about very, very frequently, but I think that is something that's coming very, in the very near future here for supply chains as well. But they're also going to become more constrained, more regulated, and more interdependent. And without governance evolving at the same pace as with the changes that are happening, that's where the struggles are really going to happen. Right. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of these planning tools, not only for manufacturing, but also how do you move your goods across like the network design tools as well. There's going to be a lot of AI in those platforms, and making sure that you are auditing your AI outputs very regularly and, diligently is very critical. A lot of people are going to use the outputs that AI provides them as the truth. And oftentimes, I'm sure even what you see with Copilot or ChatGPT, it makes its own assumptions, it jumps to its own thoughts, and that's scary, right? You need to make sure that you understand the assumptions that your tools are making so that you have a better understanding of the outputs that are coming. And I think that's really the biggest challenge that's going to happen is the pressure of AI and what it's doing to your day-to-day operations is going to be an important topic for internal audit moving forward.
So soon to be gone are the days are a grease-stained, thumb-printed receiving document that's just left on the dock that came with product being delivered, and we're gonna just see continued digitization of the supply chain, whether it be Internet of Things on pallets and SKUs and robots in distribution centers. And if I'm hearing you correctly, that's the type of things that you're referring to in terms of the evolution of risk is really the automation of the supply chain over the next couple of years.
Absolutely. And what does the governance look from a cybersecurity perspective with all that information being on the cloud? How do you make sure that only the right people see what they need to see? I know that organizations have also started talking about blockchain a good bit as well. I know that was initially a cryptocurrency only thought, but it's actually coming to a reality for certain areas. So how do you start putting governance around these types of things is going to be critical.
I've heard of blockchain being used more in the contracting space. Is that what you're referring to, or somewhere else?
Contracting space, I mean, I think this is very far out, but also in the logistics space, right? Understanding your bill of ladings and everything else across the whole supply chain, going from, a port in Asia all the way through as it makes its way across to make sure that what is on the port or what was loaded off the port onto the boat and what comes off, the end-to-end visibility of that will be seen through that blockchain as well. But again, very, very far out, I think, in my opinion.
Interesting. Okay. Wow. Okay. Filipe, any other thoughts on emerging supply chain risks that should be on internal auditors' radars?
I 100% agree with Julian. I believe that the automation is the nearest future that we have, and this automation always brings certain risks. And although everything can be automated and also AI implemented, I think that everything still heavily depends on manual inputs. And as we know, the quality of the data that is manually inputted, sometimes it's not the best one. And even with AI, you still have to train the model. And this bias on this part of the automation, that it can be something really good. On the same time, it's going to become, I believe, the biggest risk in the supply chain. And when you talk, for example, about the agriculture sector, any decision made wrong in at any part of the season can affect everything at the end of the season that you cannot correct during a production, during the season. It's not like a production or a manufacturing that you can just stop the machine and start everything from the zero. On the season, there are crops that you have like 5 years that you have to crop. So any mistake that you do in your supply chain, this can definitely affect the whole crops and the whole yields estimation. And I still believe that these outcomes, these new technologies might represent a severe risk for us in the future that we are not aware yet, that we are going to feed our risk assessments with time and as long as we start testing and seeing the situations happening.
I feel like I keep saying the next year is going to be interesting, and I just keep saying that over and over and over again. Like every year is just faced with an accelerating amount of change and new challenges to understand and overcome. On that note, I'd very much like to thank our two colleagues here, Filipe and Julien, for spending the time and sharing their insights and perspectives on this important topic. And we wish you nothing but happy auditing when you're considering supply chain risks and all the great governance, risk management, and controls that are out there to help keep that supply chain humming along. Have a great day.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey Audit Pros, GAM is back March 9th through the 11th in Las Vegas. It's where internal audit leaders come together to talk governance, emerging risk, and what's next for the profession. If you want smart conversation, fresh ideas, and some great networking along the way, head to the IIA website and register for GAM today. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and rate us. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also catch other episodes on YouTube or at theiia.org. That's THEIIA.org.